Milan, the 1560s. A young reforming archbishop named Charles Borromeo has just ordered something new built into his churches. A wooden box, fitted with a metal grill, positioned so a priest can sit on one side and a penitent can kneel on the other, and never quite touch, never quite see each other's face. Historians call it the birth of the confessional. Borromeo called it a fix for scandal, a barrier built to stop priests from taking advantage of the very people kneeling in front of them, confessing their most vulnerable failures in close physical proximity to a man they had been taught to trust without question. If you pictured confession a moment ago, box, kneeler, screen, a hushed voice on the other side, congratulations, you were picturing something younger than the printing press. Younger than the Protestant Reformation itself, which leaves an uncomfortable question sitting in the room for anyone who has ever argued about this subject online. If that box did not exist for the first millennium and a half of church history, what, exactly, were early Christians doing instead? The honest answer refuses to sit neatly on either side of the argument you have probably already heard. It is not, priests have always heard private confession exactly like this, nothing has changed. It is not, this is a medieval invention with no roots at all in the apostolic church, either. It is stranger than both claims, and far more interesting. Once you see the real shape of the history, both sides of the modern debate start to look like they are defending different centuries and calling it one continuous institution. Here is the thesis this entire video is built on. The question, did early Christians confess to a priest, assumes there was one thing called confession, practiced the same way from the apostles onward, waiting only to be either vindicated or debunked by whichever side wins the argument. There was not one thing. There were at least three distinct systems, separated by centuries, built to solve entirely different problems, and each justified from a different set of verses. Some of what early Christians actually did looks nothing like a modern confession booth. Some of it looks nothing like private prayer either. Start at the beginning, before there were bishops in the sense we would recognize, before there were parishes, before anyone had drawn a line between clergy and laity as sharply as later centuries would. The earliest Christian writing outside the biblical canon to mention confession is a short manual called the Didache, likely composed sometime in the final decades of the 1st century, though scholars continue to debate the exact date. It gives instructions for a Sunday gathering. Before you break bread, it says, "Confess your transgressions, so that your sacrifice may be pure." Notice what is missing from that instruction. No priest is named as the one you confess to, no private room, no individual appointment. The confession the Didache describes happens inside the gathered assembly, out loud, as part of communal worship, the same way a modern congregation might recite a corporate prayer of confession before communion. It is public in the most literal sense, confession spoken where the whole room can hear it. The Book of James gives a second data point from roughly the same era. Confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, so that you may be healed. Read that sentence slowly. It does not say confess to the elder. It does not say confess to the bishop. It says confess to one another, a mutual horizontal instruction aimed at the whole community, tied explicitly to healing rather than to legal pardon. A bishop named Ignatius of Antioch, writing letters on his way to execution in Rome around the year 110, adds a third data point from roughly this same window. Writing to the church at Philadelphia, he promises that the Lord grants forgiveness to anyone who repents and returns to unity with the bishop and the wider church. Notice the word unity, not confession, booth, not private appointment. Reconciliation for Ignatius meant rejoining a visible community, not completing a private transaction. A Greek word sits buried underneath all three of these texts, and it changes how you should hear them. The word is exomologio, built from a prefix meaning out from, attached to the verb to say the same thing. Literally, it means to speak something out fully, openly, without holding anything back. It is the word used for the crowds who confessed their sins publicly at the Jordan River before John baptized them in Matthew chapter 3. Confession, at its linguistic root, was never designed as a whisper. It was designed as an open acknowledgement other people could hear. The Gospels use that same word for an even earlier scene. Matthew describes crowds streaming out to the Jordan River, confessing their sins as John baptized them, the sins spoken aloud, in the open air, in front of everyone else waiting in line. Whatever else changed over the next 2,000 years, the earliest recorded instance of Christian confession happened outdoors, in public, before a single church building had even been constructed. Here is the first place this video is going to take a position rather than simply relay one. Modern defenders of private, priest-only confession sometimes reach back to these first-century texts as if they already describe the practice you would recognize from a Catholic parish. Today, they do not. The earliest layer of evidence points towards something communal and mutual. closer to a support group saying its struggles out loud than to an individual appointment behind a curtain. That distinction matters, and skipping past it flattens real history into a straight line it never actually followed. But something happened in the 2nd and 3rd centuries that forced the earliest form of confession to change shape entirely. And understanding why requires understanding a crisis the Church nearly did not survive. Baptism, in the earliest centuries, was understood as a single, total washing away of sin administered once, usually to adults who had made a conscious decision to follow Christ. That left an obvious and uncomfortable question hanging over every congregation. What happens when a baptized believer sins again, and not in some small, forgivable way, but catastrophically? Adultery, murder, and under Roman persecution, the sin every church in the empire eventually had to reckon with: denying Christ to save your own life. Tertullian, a lawyer turned Christian writer working in Carthage in North Africa around the year 200, gives the fullest early description of what the Church did about this. He calls the process exomologesis, borrowing that same Greek root, and describes something that looks less like a private appointment and more like a public medical quarantine. The sinner confesses the specific grave sin to the bishop. The bishop assigns a period, sometimes lasting years, of visible penance: sackcloth, ashes, exclusion from communion, kneeling at the church door, while the rest of the congregation walked past. Picture a hospital ward rather than a doctor's private office, and you will understand the logic. In a small, tightly bound ancient congregation, meeting in someone's house, sharing a single common meal and a single cup, serious sin functioned less like a private stain and more like a contagion of trust. Everyone needed to see the sinner readmitted, verified, restored, the same way a community needed to see a quarantined patient formally cleared before letting them back among healthy neighbors. Sharing a table, sharing a cup, sharing a common life. Nobody could simply take your word for it from across the room. Reconciliation had to be witnessed, in the flesh, by the people you had wronged, simply by breaking trust with the body you belonged to. Half a century after Tertullian, that theory was tested by an actual epidemic of failure, and the man forced to manage it was Cyprian, a wealthy convert who became Bishop of Carthage only 2 years after his baptism, serving from roughly 248 until Roman authorities executed him for his faith in 258. The Emperor Decius had launched an empire-wide persecution demanding public sacrifice to the Roman gods, and enormous numbers of Christians complied. Large numbers sacrificed outright. Others bribed officials for a certificate falsely claiming they had sacrificed, without actually doing it. Cyprian himself had gone into hiding rather than face arrest, a decision that drew criticism even from members of his own congregation. When he returned, he found the church split down the middle over what to do with the lapsed. Confessors, believers who had suffered imprisonment or torture for refusing to sacrifice, began issuing their own certificates of pardon, effectively claiming their suffering had earned them the authority to forgive the failures of others. Cyprian pushed back hard. His solution, worked out at a council held after Easter in the year 251, sorted the lapsed into categories based on the severity of what they had done, and assigned penance accordingly. Those who had bribed their way to a false certificate, called the libellatici, faced a real but survivable path back. Those who had actually burned incense before an idol, or offered a sacrifice outright, were, in Cyprian's original ruling, only to be reconciled on their deathbed. It was severe. It was also, in Cyprian's mind, the only way to keep confession from becoming a transaction anyone could buy their way around. The dispute over how strict this had to be split the wider church. A Roman presbyter named Novatian argued the opposite extreme, that the lapsed could never be readmitted to communion at all, no matter how long or how public their penance. Novatian's followers broke away into a rival church that lasted for centuries in parts of the empire. Cyprian's middle position, mercy joined to real accountability, eventually became the standard the rest of the Western Church settled on, but only after a genuine and lasting schism. Look at what this system is not. It is not repeatable. In its strictest early form, exomologesis could be undergone once in a Christian's lifetime. It is not private. The entire community watched the penitent's exclusion and eventual return, and it was not, in these earliest centuries, primarily concerned with the small daily sins an ordinary believer might commit between Sundays. It existed for the catastrophic ruptures, apostasy, murder, adultery, the sins that threatened to unravel the community's ability to trust itself. This is where the second position of this video needs stating plainly. When modern apologists cite Tertullian and Cyprian as proof that the early church confessed to a priest just like we do today, they are quietly erasing everything that makes this system strange to modern eyes. A once-in-a-lifetime, publicly witnessed, years-long penitential process bears almost no resemblance to a private weekly visit to a confessional booth. Treating exomologesis as an early draft of the modern sacrament is not dishonest by accident, it is dishonest by omission. Most explainer videos on this subject skip straight from Tertullian to a modern confessional, as if 14 centuries simply did not happen in between. That skip is not a small shortcut. It hides the single most consequential development in the entire history of confession, the moment someone had to invent private, repeatable penance from scratch, because nothing resembling it existed yet anywhere in Christian practice. So how did the Church get from a public, once-only, bishop-supervised crisis process to something you could do privately, repeatedly, for ordinary sins, with a priest instead of a bishop? The answer did not come from Rome. It came from Ireland, and it took roughly 4 centuries to arrive. John Cassian, a monk born around the year 360, likely somewhere in the region of modern Romania, travelled as a young man to live among the desert fathers of Egypt, absorbing decades of hard-won monastic wisdom before eventually founding 2 monasteries near Marseille in southern Gaul. He brought a very different model of spiritual life back with him to the Western Church. In the Egyptian desert, monks confessed their private thoughts and struggles to an experienced elder constantly, not as a crisis measure, but as an ordinary discipline of the soul, the way an athlete might check in with a coach after every practice, rather than only after a catastrophic injury. Irish monasticism absorbed this Eastern desert tradition through Cassian's writings and pushed it somewhere new. By the 6th century, monks in Ireland were confessing their faults privately and repeatedly to an abbot or a chosen confessor, receiving a private penance calibrated to the specific sin, and returning to ordinary life without public exclusion at all. Handbooks called penitentials began circulating, listing sins alongside recommended penances, the way a modern reference manual might pair a diagnosis with a treatment. Columbanus, an Irish monk born around 543, who left Ireland to found monasteries across Gaul and Italy, carried this practice onto the European continent along with his penitential handbooks. The penitentials themselves worked like a tariff schedule, a specific sin paired with a specific remedy, usually a stretch of fasting on bread and water, sometimes measured in months, sometimes in years, occasionally reducible through almsgiving for the sick or the poor. A wealthier penitent could sometimes negotiate a shorter, harsher substitute penance, or even pay another person to complete part of it on their behalf, an arrangement later reformers would come to see as an obvious abuse waiting to happen. Continental bishops did not universally welcome the change. A gathering of bishops at Toledo in 589 appears to have condemned some version of repeatable private penance as a dangerous novelty, though historians still argue over exactly which practice that condemnation targeted, and whether it was aimed at the Irish innovation specifically. Think about the actual shift here in the most physical terms available. The earlier system was a quarantine ward, visible, communal, built around public verification that the sinner was truly restored. The Irish innovation was closer to a private doctor's office. You walked in, described the specific problem, received a specific treatment, and walked out without the waiting room ever learning your business. Both models treat sin as something requiring treatment. They disagree completely on whether the treatment needs witnesses. This is the video's third position, and it cuts against a reflex many viewers on both sides of this debate probably share. The Irish invention of private, repeatable confession was not corruption, and it was not a restoration of some lost apostolic purity either. It was a genuine, datable innovation, invented by people solving a real pastoral problem. A system that only worked for catastrophic, once-in-a-lifetime sins, left ordinary believers with nowhere to bring their ordinary, recurring failures. The Irish monks noticed the gap and built something to fill it. Once private confession existed as an option, the institutional church spent the next several centuries deciding how mandatory to make it. That process reached its clearest landmark under Pope Innocent III. Elected in 1198 and widely regarded as one of the most powerful popes in medieval history, who called an enormous gathering of bishops to Rome in the year 1215, remembered as the Fourth Lateran Council. Its 21st canon, known by its opening Latin words, omnis utriusque sexus, all people of both sexes, required every Christian who had reached the age of moral responsibility to confess all their sins to their own parish priest. At least once a year, historians studying the canon are careful to note it did not invent sacramental confession from nothing. It confirmed and universalized a practice that had already been spreading through Europe for centuries via the Irish and Anglo-Saxon missions. What it did accomplish was turning a widespread custom into binding church law, with excommunication as the penalty for skipping it, and it named the parish priest specifically as the ordinary minister of the rite, tightening what had once been a looser, more monastic arrangement into a parish-level obligation for every layperson in Western Christendom. Worth pausing on here briefly, a monastic practice built by desert-influenced Irish monks to help fellow ascetics examine their own conscience had within roughly 6 centuries become an annual legal requirement enforced on every farmer, merchant, and noble in Western Europe under threat of excommunication. An optional spiritual discipline for the especially devoted had ended as compulsory law for everyone, a transformation worth noticing, regardless of whether you think it was wise. Even after Lateran, the confessional box you pictured at the start of this video still did not exist. For roughly 3.5 more centuries, a penitent confessing privately typically knelt beside a priest seated in an open part of the church, in view of anyone walking past, though not close enough to overhear the words themselves. The next major turning point arrived when the Roman Catholic Church convened the Council of Trent across several sessions in the middle of the 1500s, called largely in response to the Protestant Reformation. Trent reaffirmed confession as one of 7 sacraments, and for the first time spelled out in precise terms that a penitent needed to confess every mortal sin by kind, and by number, not merely in general terms. That single clarification pushed the practice toward the detailed, itemized model many people still associate with Catholic confession today, and it demanded a very particular kind of memory from ordinary believers, not a general sense of having failed, but an inventory, counted and categorized, ready to be recited on command. That shift changed what an ordinary Catholic layperson actually carried around in daily life. Confession stopped being a general acknowledgement that something had gone wrong and became closer to bookkeeping, a running ledger of specific transgressions a person needed to track accurately enough to report it later. Regardless of what else this accomplished, it gave confession a legalistic weight the earliest Christians confessing openly at a riverbank would likely not have recognized. It was only in the wake of Trent that Charles Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan from 1564, added his wooden box with its dividing grille, aiming to prevent the kind of physical proximity. That had made confession a setting for real, documented abuse. The box was never a theological requirement. It was a piece of church furniture invented to solve a disciplinary problem, roughly 1,500 years after the practice it housed first began to take shape. Which brings the story to its final split, and it is not the split most people assume it is. It is worth remembering that the entire Reformation traces back in no small part to an argument about penance. Martin Luther's original grievance in his 95 Theses, posted in 1517, targeted indulgences sold to reduce the penance still owed after confession, not confession itself. The system this video has been tracing was not incidental to the Reformation. It was one of its opening battlegrounds. The Protestant Reformation did not produce one unified rejection of confession, though. It produced at least 4 distinct answers, scattered across the very reformers people assume agreed with each other. Martin Luther, born in 1483, kept private confession and absolution. He simply refused to call it a sacrament in the same technical sense Rome did, and he made it voluntary rather than legally required. "I will let no one take away private confession," he wrote, "and would not exchange it for all the wealth of the world, for I know what strength and comfort it has given me." The Augsburg Confession, drafted by his colleague Melanchthon, explicitly instructs Lutheran churches to retain private absolution while dropping the requirement to enumerate every single sin, which Luther considered psychologically and practically impossible anyway. John Calvin, born in 1509 and eventually settling in Geneva to lead its Reformation, took a different road. He rejected the idea that a private, itemized confession to a priest was necessary for salvation, and he stripped away the Roman framework of assigned penance as payment. But he retained corporate public confession as a standing feature of Reformed worship, spoken by the whole congregation together, and he allowed that a struggling believer might still seek out a wise pastor for confidential counsel, just without treating that conversation as a sacrament channeling grace. Huldrych Zwingli, the Zurich reformer born in 1484, and the early Anabaptist movement that grew partly out of his circle, went further still, discarding any formal human confessor altogether and locating confession entirely between the believer and God in private prayer. For an ordinary believer raised in this branch of the Reformation, the entire weight of a guilty conscience now rested on private prayer alone, with no human voice ever assigned to speak assurance back out loud. Meanwhile, English reformers charted something closer to a middle path, a phrase often attributed to the theologian Richard Hooker, though its precise origin is debated by historians, summarizes the Anglican position. That survives to this day. All may, some should, none must, referring to private confession before a priest as available, sometimes advisable, but never compulsory for salvation. Set beside all 4 of these Western answers, Eastern Orthodoxy took a track of its own that Western debates usually ignore entirely. In the earliest Byzantine centuries, the East followed a pattern close to Cyprian's, a canonical, bishop-supervised process reserved for grave sin. Over time, monastic communities normalized a gentler, more frequent practice of confessing to an experienced monk called a spiritual father, whether or not that monk was ordained a priest, and that monastic habit gradually spread outward to ordinary lay believers. Orthodox Christians today confess to a priest, but Orthodox theology has consistently resisted the Western legal framework of penance as a debt paid down through assigned works. Confession in Orthodox practice is described as therapeutic, a physician tending a wound rather than a courtroom weighing a sentence. That framing sits closer in spirit to the original sense of exomologio than to the juridical satisfaction language that developed in the medieval West. The penance a priest assigns, called an epitomia, is meant as medicine for the soul, not payment toward a debt. That brings this video to its fourth and final position, and it is the one most likely to unsettle viewers regardless of which tradition raised them. The most radically private model, the idea that confession is purely a silent transaction between an individual and God with no human witness required at all, sits furthest from the apostolic pattern this video began with. James did not write, "Confess your sins to God alone in the quiet of your own heart." He wrote, "Confess to one another," using a word that means to speak fully out loud. Something apostolic gets lost the moment confession becomes entirely private, whether the confessor wears a collar or does not exist at all. Walk into almost any church this coming Sunday, whatever the denomination painted on the sign outside, and you can still see fragments of every single stage this video just walked through, layered on top of one another, like sediment left behind by centuries of argument. A shared, spoken prayer of confession recited by the whole congregation together echoes the Didache. A private conversation with a pastor or a spiritual director echoes the Irish monks. A quiet, individual prayer, directed to God alone, with no human witness at all, echoes Zwingli. None of these fragments arrived by accident, and none of them is actually older than the others in the way its own defenders usually assume, when they argue about which practice counts as truly original. That leaves every viewer of this video standing somewhere along a 2,000-year line that never stopped moving. Public confession before a watching congregation, spoken aloud at a riverbank before anyone had built a church to hold it in. A once-in-a-lifetime, bishop-supervised crisis process built for the gravest sins. Tested nearly to breaking by an empire that demanded apostasy as the price of survival. A private, repeatable innovation born in Irish monasteries and carried across an entire continent by missionary monks, who never asked Rome's permission first. A legal requirement enforced by an ecumenical council of hundreds of bishops. A single sentence at Trent that turned a general practice into an itemized accounting of specific sins. A wooden box, built in Milan for reasons that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with protecting the vulnerable from the powerful. A splintering 4 different ways when the Reformation broke Western Christendom apart into pieces that still have not reassembled. And an Eastern tradition that kept the priest but discarded the courtroom entirely, calling the whole encounter medicine rather than a verdict. None of these forms is the one, true, unbroken apostolic practice, waiting to be either defended or debunked, because that single continuous thing never existed. Zoom out far enough, past every council and every schism, and what remains is not an institution at all. It is a single, stubborn conviction that has survived every century, willing to fight over its details. Sin does not heal in total isolation. Something changes, some weight actually lifts, when a struggle is spoken where another living person can hear it and answer back, rather than rehearsed silently in a mind. That is often the least reliable judge of itself. The box in Milan and the crowd at the Jordan River are separated by roughly 15 centuries of argument, invention, schism, and reform, and they still share that one unbroken thing in common. Whatever changed about who was allowed to listen, how often you were allowed to speak, and what price you had to pay afterward. Nobody in 2,000 years of this history ever seriously argued that sin was best left completely unspoken, sealed away from every other human being, addressed only in the silence of a single mind, talking to itself in the dark. So here is the only question worth carrying out of this video, whatever your own tradition says on the matter. Not, does my church do this the ancient way? Every church's current version is younger, stranger, and more historically contingent than its own defenders usually admit, this video included. The real question sits underneath all of that argument, and it is considerably harder to dodge. Is there a living person in your life you say the hard thing to out loud, or does every failure stay locked inside a conversation you are only ever having with yourself? Perhaps this walk through the history left you wanting the other side of this conversation. The next video in this series takes on the doctrine sitting right next door to confession. what the early church actually believed happened to those who died still carrying unconfessed sin, and how that single question split East from West even further apart than this one ever did. Bring the same patience to that history that you brought to this one, because it moves through just as many centuries and rewards the same close attention.